Raj Mehta is an addiction therapist. But addiction therapist is too narrow of a term to truly describe Raj's all-encompassing passion for helping people overcome their addictions. In fact, Raj is extra motivated because he overcame an addiction to heroin himself. He's been there. He knows what it's like. Now, he stands before us today to challenge our deeply rooted beliefs about what addiction is and what it means for our society. Ladies and gentlemen, Raj Mehta.
Hello, Ann Arbor. How are we doing today? Glad to be here. My name is Raj, and I'm an addiction killer. So what does that mean? I'm not addiction's friend. And so before we go any further, do I have permission to tell the truth? Because in this part of my life, I kind of get in trouble for telling the truth about things. And so we're going to talk about addiction and what it is, but most importantly, I do all kinds of things. I'm a former heroin addict that crawled across the streets of Detroit, across broken glass to eventually graduate from U of M with a 4.0. I'm here to break some stigma, okay? People can change. And thank you, and people can change. And I do this for many of the people that didn't make it. And so in talking about addiction, we're going to be honest with each other and kind of go through some different ground. But it's really important that we get basically a holistic view of what addiction is. And here's our first slide. Addiction is not just the individual. Think about the individual as a pebble that falls into a pond, okay? As that pebble falls into the pond, it cascades outward. And that impact has direct effects on that person's family and on their friends and on their school. And as that cascades outward, it begins to impact the county and the city. And as it begins to cascade outward, it begins to affect the state and the nation and the world. The bottom line is that addiction is a bidirectional reciprocal relationship with the environment. The addict does not abuse drugs or alcohol in a vacuum. It goes back and forth. And this bidirectional relationship plays into this whole thing that we have is called mixed messages. America is in a constant state of ambivalence, feeling two ways about addiction. For example, we say that drugs are illegal, but they're really easy to get a hold of. Just try going on Silk Road. We say drugs are illegal, but we have kids that are abusing them that get caught and get in trouble. And so we have all these things that are going back and forth, all these mixed messages. Let's give an example of that. I watch TV, and America talks about people and all kinds of stuff goes on television, and it's a media that kind of reinforces what our values are supposed to be. So I watch politicians on television. I'm not dumb, but I can't understand some of their statements. And politicians will say, the children are our future, and the future is our children. So I'm thinking about that in terms of, okay, that must be very important to you, what you're talking about. Then we begin to talk about, well, let's see the actionable results of that. Does anybody in this room know how many places there are to lock up children in kiddie prisons in Michigan? Have any idea if a kid misbehaves themselves and commits some crime or gets caught with drugs? How many places in Michigan can lock them up in a maximum security facility? Well, there's 40. There's 40 places to lock kids up. Let me ask you an important question. How many places are there for rehab for inpatient kids under the age of 18 in Michigan? Not going to like this. One place. With about a 30-day waiting list. And so think about it. 40-to-1 ratio about how you feel about children. Is that making sense? So we talk about this. This is kind of the ambivalence that we talk about. America is also very unique in another way. Only 2 countries in the entire world allow prescription drugs to be advertised on television. Now, there's a lot of countries in this world, right? So think about it. Only America and New Zealand allow big pharma to advertise prescription drugs on television. I call that a mixed message. Is that making sense? Let's go on to our next slide. We talk about the disease of addiction. Has anybody ever heard of addiction being referred to as a disease? Must have heard that at some point, right? And so let's try to figure out what that actually means. According to the American Medical Association, for anything to be a disease, it must meet 2 criteria. And those criteria are very simple. It must have symptoms, and it must be treatable. Think about a person that goes to his doctor, and he gets his blood work results back, and the doctor says, here's the deal. You have high blood sugar. Sir, you have diabetes. Think about that. How's that person going to respond to his doctor? Well, doctor, how do I treat this illness? How do I deal with this disease? And doctor says, well, it's very simple. We're going to give you insulin. So diabetes meets the model of a disease because it's got symptoms and it's treatable. The symptoms are the high blood sugar and it's treatable with insulin. Let's go a step further. Imagine if your friend comes up to you and says, I have the flu, the influenza virus. I'm very sick today. I can't go to class. What are some symptoms that you're going to look for in that individual while they're standing right in front of you that tells you whether or not this person has the flu? Anybody got some basic flu symptoms in their mind? Congestion, fever, runny nose, vomiting, right? This person has, physical symptoms that are readily apparent that they're ill and they're telling you the truth. Let's go the same direction with the disease of addiction, but think about it from a more sophisticated model. So a person in stage 1 cancer walks onto the stage and they say, I got stage 1 cancer. You really can't tell for sure they're ill. Another person comes on the stage and says, I got stage 4 cancer. It's pretty apparent that person is very ill. So for the illustration of this idea, let's think about the stereotypical homeless, drug addict, alcoholic. The guy that's out there panhandling money for change to get more drugs and alcohol. What's different about that man physically? Well, think about it. We're going to be honest. He doesn't look so good, doesn't smell so good, and doesn't dress so good. Those are signs and symptoms this guy's not doing too well. Let's kind of break this down a little bit further. If I'm a homeless person and I'm strung out to the gills on drugs and alcohol, what am I thinking about all day long? Where do I get more drugs? Where do I get more alcohol? I got a fifth in my hand. What am I thinking about? Where's the next fifth coming from? I'm a heroin addict with a pocket full of heroin, walking down the alley. What am I thinking about? Where do I get more heroin? So over a period of time, I have this obsession with the drug. And obsessions left untreated, as your mind keeps ruminating over and over again, that develops anxiety. And anxiety left untreated will morph into depression. So here I am, this homeless drug addict with an obsession with drugs, high anxiety, and high depression. But on top of that, let's kind of speculate together. For a person to become homeless in America, they must have burnt a lot of bridges. Mom and dad must have said to them straight to their face, we are done with you. Their friends and family, the kids they grew up with said, we are done with you. The employer said, we are done with you. To get to that process, to go to that low bottom, what must have happened? Well, at some point, that person must have made a bunch of promises. Imagine this. I realize I have a drug problem, and I tell somebody, I have a drug problem, I have an alcohol problem, I promise to stop. And that person's looking me right in the eyes. And the worst part about the story is that in that moment, I mean that to the very core of my being. I mean that to my heart. I really want to stop. I won't do this again tomorrow. If I kept making promises to you and I really meant them, and I kept breaking those promises to you, how would I feel about myself? Anybody have an idea? Well, I have lower self-esteem. I have lower self-confidence. I have lower self-efficacy. And as I begin to feel really bad about myself, I have high levels of anxiety, high levels of depression. What do you think I'm going to do all day long to make those feelings go away? Is that making sense? So let's talk about social signs of disease of addiction. We talk about crying moms. We talk about legal signs of addiction, law enforcement intervening, all kinds of drug charges. We talk about the financial symptoms of addiction, and even the spiritual ones, turning good men into bank robbers, turning good women into prostitutes. See, the flu is very easy to treat. It only has physical symptoms. Addiction is very difficult to treat. It has physical, mental, legal symptoms, financial symptoms, and spiritual symptoms all going on simultaneously. But the main symptom of addiction is the inability to get high successfully. No, I'm not challenging anybody in this room to go out and try to use heroin successfully. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm trying to indicate is that when a person has a drug or alcohol problem, they begin to have problems when they use. For example, if when you abuse drugs and alcohol, your liver's beginning to fail you, you're not doing it right. If when you use drugs and alcohol, you begin to have mental health issues, you probably are an addict. If when you get high, your mom begins to cry, your wife begins to cry, your brother begins to cry, you probably have an addiction problem. If when you get high, law enforcement keeps showing up, there could be an issue there, right? And if when you get high, you begin to break your spiritual values, your morals, and your belief system, there could be an issue that's going on. Is that making sense? So we talk about on the micro level this inability to get high successfully. And this is called basically Addiction is a biopsychosocial disease that's undergirded by damage and dysfunction to the reward feedback loop of the brain. Essentially, that precious part, the most valuable real estate in the world, the mind, has been hijacked. And I can illustrate this with the 3 C's: cravings, trying to control, and consequences. Addicts have intense cravings to use drugs and alcohol. If you want to know what those cravings feel like, I can give you an experiment. Please take a box of X-Lax and swallow the entire box, and then use your willpower not to use the restroom for 2 days. That's what cravings feel like to an addict or alcoholic. We talk about those intense cravings, those urges, and how powerful they are. The second C ties into trying to control their using. At some point, when a person begins to abuse drugs and alcohol, they want to try to use less, use with different people, not use that drug over and over again. And this failed control using plays into the whole stigma and damage to the psyche. The final C is consequences. When addicts abuse drugs and alcohol, they experience severe consequences over a period of time. And those consequences can include death and long-term incarceration. Is that making sense? So in America, we have 2.2 million people in jail or in prison. That's more than any other country in the world. That's more than China and India combined. And 75% of those people are alcoholics and addicts, and everybody knows that. America is 5% of the world's population, but we consume 40% of the world's illegal drugs. Think about that. 5% consuming 40%. America is 5% of the world's population. We consume 99% of the world's produced Vicodin. Wow, that's amazing. Let's talk about policies and things that actually influence and promote addiction. Is everybody in this room aware that being caught with 0 to 50 grams of any controlled substance is a felony? So the powder residue on a mirror of cocaine is a felony charge. 1 Adderall in your pocket doesn't belong to you, that's a felony charge. 1 Xanax that doesn't belong to you is a felony charge. So let's go with a hypothetical scenario. Let's say that I'm a U of M student and I'm walking around and I haven't been studying for my examination and kind of blowing off the test. One of my friends says to me, "Hey, Raj, you got to cram. You got to do 24 hours of studying. How are you going to do that?" Well, I'm going to take some Adderall. So I swallow a couple Adderall, keep 1 in my pocket for good luck, right? And I get all my work done, and I get my examination done, and the next day I want to celebrate that with a beer. So I'm drinking a beer on campus, and all of a sudden, campus police show up. They're like, "Hey, young man, what's that in your pocket?" "Oh, don't worry, officer. That's just an Adderall that my friend gave me for my examination. Now I have a felony charge. Then I have a felony conviction." In case you don't know that, with a felony charge and felony conviction, you can't even work at McDonald's. You can't even get a student loan. And now I'm set up for the spiraling staircase downwards into the stigma and despair of addiction. Is that making sense? We talk about things and want to kind of bring the idea home that addiction on a macro level is a systemic failure. It's a failure in institutions, organizations, and policies that drive and promote addiction over and over again. There's a famous story about the starfish on the shore. A mom and her daughter came to the beach, and they saw thousands of starfish being washed onto the shore. And the mom began to look at this, and the daughter watched it as well, and they began to observe as the starfish began to die. And the little girl began to pick up the starfish one by one and throw them back into the water. The mom is watching this, and she kind of rolls her eyes. She says, "Honey, it doesn't matter. There's so many starfish there. It's inconsequential." And Dar looks up at her mom, and she says, "Well, Mom, it matters to the ones that I throw back in." You follow what I'm saying? It matters to the individual. It matters to their family. But now we have to stop the tide. We got to stop the tide from rolling in. So instead of looking at addiction from this criminal model, instead of viewing addiction from the lens of criminality, let's begin to look at addiction through the lens of a mental health issue, as a mental health disorder. Is that making sense? Fortune favors the bold. Thank you for your time.